While I was away on a business trip, my son-in-law took his mistress on a luxury yacht trip in Dubai to enjoy a lavish life while he left my daughter locked alone at home. On the sixth day at midnight, a stranger called me and said I saw her sitting by the window since 4 p.m. I immediately took the first flight home and did something he never saw coming. Welcome back to Dad's Revenge Stories. I am truly grateful you are here. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Please note, this story includes dramatized elements crafted for entertainment and educational value, though its underlying message remains vital for every family. I have spent 40 years reading blueprints in bad lighting, sleeping in trailers on job sites, and eating gas station sandwiches cold because the microwave was broken and the deadline was not. I know how to fall asleep anywhere. Hotel rooms, airport benches, the passenger seat of a truck with the engine still running. Sleep has never been a problem for me. So when I found myself lying on top of the covers in room 214 of the Desert Palms Inn outside Henderson, Nevada, staring at the water stain on the ceiling at 11:43 at night, I knew something was already wrong. I just did not know what yet. The project was a commercial renovation on the east side of the city. A converted warehouse some developer wanted, turned into luxury loft units before the end of Q2. 3 weeks of work, maybe 4. I had taken the contract because it was straightforward, and because Emily had said, "Go, Dad, we are fine, stop hovering." I had believed her. I had believed the man standing next to her when she said it. I picked up my phone from the nightstand and checked the time again. 11:47. I put it back down. I closed my eyes. I counted the sounds in the room the way Carol used to tell me to do when my mind would not stop running. The air conditioner. A car passing on the highway. Somewhere down the hall, a television with the volume too high. Carol had been gone 6 years, and I still heard her voice giving me instructions in quiet rooms. My phone rang. The number on the screen was a 310 area code. Los Angeles. I did not recognize it. For 1 second, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Then something in my chest, something that had no name and did not need one, made me pick up. "Is this Richard Calloway?" A woman's voice. Careful. The kind of careful that means the person has rehearsed what they are about to say. Speaking. Mr. Calloway, my name is Linda Marsh. I manage the Green Valley convenience store on Arcadia Boulevard in Los Feliz. She paused. I am sorry to call so late. I sat up. My feet hit the carpet before she finished the sentence. Emily, what happened? Is she hurt? She is not hurt, Linda said quickly. Not that I can see. But Mr. Calloway, I have been watching your daughter sit in the window of her house since about 4 o'clock this afternoon. It is almost midnight. She has not moved. She has not turned on any lights. I can see her from my store entrance, and She stopped. I could not go home without calling someone. The air conditioner kept running. The television down the hall kept going. I stood in the middle of room 214 in my socks, and I made myself breathe once before I said anything. Which window? The front one, left side of the house, ground floor. I knew that window. I had designed it. 14 inches wider than standard, because Emily had wanted to put a reading chair there. I had argued it would affect the load distribution on the north wall. She had said, Dad, it is a chair, not a boulder. I had widened the window. Has she responded to you at all? I asked. I knocked on the door about an hour ago. She opened it. She looked. Linda chose her next word slowly. Exhausted. She handed me her phone and pointed to your name in her contacts. She did not say much. She just said, please. My throat tightened so fast it surprised me. Is she still at the door? No, sir. She went back to the chair. I was already moving to the closet. Linda, I need you to do something for me. I need you to go back over there and sit with her. Can you do that? I already told my cashier to close up, Linda said. I am not going anywhere. I stopped moving for a moment. A stranger in Los Angeles had already decided she was not leaving my daughter alone, and I was 280 miles away in a hotel room that smelled like carpet cleaner and recycled air. I pressed my hand flat against the closet door and held it there for a count of 3. Thank you, I said. I mean that. Just come home, Mr. Calloway. I called Jason next. He picked up on the second ring, which told me he was awake. His voice was relaxed, almost cheerful, the voice of a man lying somewhere comfortable. Richard, everything okay? That is what I am calling to ask, I said. Where is Emily? A half-second pause, small enough that most people would not have caught it. I have spent 4 decades sitting across negotiating tables from men who thought they were good liars. A half-second pause is not nothing. So she is home, Jason said. Probably asleep by now. Why? Someone just called me. Said they saw her sitting alone at the window. She does that sometimes. His tone shifted into something warm and slightly condescending, the way you talk to someone whose concern you find mildly inconvenient. You know how she gets when she is tired. She zones out. Richard, I promise you she is fine. I promise you she is fine. I wrote that sentence somewhere in the back of my mind and left it there. Where are you right now? I asked. Another pause, slightly longer than the first. On a project. Remote location signal has been spotty all week. I have been meaning to check in more, but the schedule has been brutal. Right, I said. Get some rest, Jason. I ended the call and opened the airline app on my phone. The first flight from Las Vegas McCarran to LAX departed at 5:55 in the morning. I would need to drive 90 minutes to get there. I booked the ticket before I finished doing the math. Then I sat on the edge of the bed, and I thought about what kind of man tells a worried father that his daughter is probably asleep with that particular brand of smoothness at 11:53 at night, when a stranger across the street has been watching that same daughter sit motionless in a dark window for nearly 8 hours. I thought about Carol and what she would have said. She would have said, Richard, you already know. You have known since you picked up that phone. I picked up my bag and started packing. The drive from LAX to Los Feliz takes 22 minutes at 4:30 in the morning, when the freeways are empty, and the city has not yet remembered it is supposed to be loud. I know because I drove it without the radio, without a phone call, without anything except the sound of my own breathing and the yellow lines disappearing under the hood of my rental car, one after another. I had built things in this city for 31 years. Office parks in Glendale, a mixed-use complex in Silver Lake that won a regional design award in 2009. The kind of work that leaves something standing after you are gone. I had always believed that was enough. That if you built carefully, if you checked every joint and every load-bearing wall and every foundation pour the things you loved would hold. I turned onto Arcadia Boulevard at 4:48 and saw the light in the window immediately. Linda Marsh was sitting on Emily's front step with a paper cup of coffee in both hands and a look on her face that told me she had not slept either. She stood when she saw my headlights and met me at the bottom of the porch stairs. She was a woman somewhere in her early 60s, gray hair pulled back, wearing a store uniform jacket with the Green Valley logo on the chest. Thank you for staying. My voice came out steadier than I felt. You did not have to do that. Linda looked at me with the particular directness of a woman who had stopped having patience for unnecessary statements sometime around her 50th birthday. Yes, I did, she said. Go see your daughter, Mr. Calloway. The front door was unlocked. I pushed it open and the smell of the house hit me first. Stale air, closed windows, the faint sweetness of food left out too long. The living room was dark except for the gray light coming through the front window, and Emily was sitting in the reading chair I had argued against, and then widened the window for. She was smaller than I remembered. That was the first thought. Not that she looked thin or pale or injured, though she was all of those things, just that she was smaller. The way a person gets smaller when they have been frightened for a long time and have had no one to be unfrightened with. Her left foot was propped on the ottoman wrapped in a bandage that had started to loosen at the edges. Her phone was on the cushion beside her, dark and dead. Her hands were folded in her lap with the careful stillness of someone who has learned not to make sudden movements. She looked up when I walked in, and her face did something complicated and painful that I will not try to describe, because I do not think there are words that fit it exactly. Her eyes filled and her chin pulled down, and she pressed her lips together hard, and what came out of her mouth was not crying. It was worse than crying. Dad. Just that. Just my name. I crossed the room in 4 steps and crouched in front of her chair and took both her hands in mine. They were ice cold. The kind of cold that means a person has been sitting very still for a very long time. I am here, I said. I have you. Emily's shoulders broke forward, and she pressed her forehead against my shoulder and made a sound I had not heard from her since she was 7 years old and fell off her bicycle in front of our house on a Sunday afternoon. Carol had been the one to scoop her up that day. I had stood 2 feet away with my hands at my sides, useless, with the specific helplessness of a father watching his child hurt. I was not useless this time. I held on. After a while, she pulled back and wiped her face with the back of her wrist and said, I am sorry. I did not want to bother you. Something hot moved through my chest. Emily, you had the Henderson project. You said the timeline was tight and the client was already pushing back, and I did not want to be the reason you... Stop. My voice came out harder than I meant. I softened it. You are never a reason. Do you understand me? You call me. Every time. You call me. She nodded, but her eyes slid sideways in the way they did when she was agreeing with something she did not quite believe yet. I looked at her foot. How long has it been like that? A few weeks. Has anyone looked at it properly? Jason took me to urgent care. She said his name without any particular expression, which was its own kind of expression. They wrapped it, told me to stay off it. I looked around the room. At the kitchen counter visible through the doorway, where a pot sat on the stove with the lid slightly askew. At the small pile of delivery containers near the recycling bin that told me Emily had eaten exactly twice in the last several days, based on the number of bags. At the windowsill, where a thin layer of dust had settled on the latch, meaning it had not been opened in some time. Then I went to the kitchen and opened the junk drawer where Emily had kept a backup phone charger since college. Empty. I checked the outlet behind the microwave. Nothing. I opened the drawer beneath the coffee maker. I checked the basket on the counter where keys and mail and random cables accumulated the way they do in every house. Nothing and nothing and nothing. I came back to the doorway and looked at my daughter. Emily, where are all the chargers? She pulled her bottom lip between her teeth. I could not find them. I looked everywhere I knew to look. She paused. Jason said there was one in the office, but the office was locked. I put my hand on the doorframe and held it there. He locked the office. He always locks it. His work files are in there. She said it the way people say things they have said so many times they no longer hear what the words actually mean. I walked back to the kitchen and found the notepad on the counter beside the refrigerator. A sheet of paper in Jason's handwriting. Neat block letters, the kind of handwriting that looks organized and thoughtful. Instructions for the microwave settings. The alarm code. A note about the trash collection day. And at the bottom, underlined twice, do not call your father unless it is a real emergency. He has enough on his plate. I read that line 3 times. Then I folded the paper carefully the way I fold documents I intend to keep, and I put it in the inside pocket of my jacket. "Emily," I said from the kitchen doorway. "Where is Jason right now?" My daughter looked at me across the dim living room, and for the first time since I had walked through that door, something in her face shifted from exhausted into something much more careful. "He said he was on a project," she said. "But Dad..." She stopped. "I do not think that is true." I made tea because it was the only thing I could think to do with my hands. Emily's kitchen was the kind of kitchen I had designed with Carol in mind, years before Emily ever lived in it. Wide counter space. Deep sink. A window above the stove that caught the morning light when the marine layer burned off. I had drawn this kitchen on a Saturday afternoon at our dining room table while Carol sat across from me grading student papers, and I had thought someday Emily will cook in this kitchen, and it will feel like home. I filled the kettle and set it on the burner and listened to it heat up while Emily watched me from the doorway, her weight on her good foot, one hand on the frame to steady herself. "You do not have to do that," she said. "I know." I found 2 mugs in the cabinet above the coffee maker. "Sit down before you fall down." She made her way to the kitchen table and lowered herself into the chair closest to the window. The morning was starting to come in gray and thin through the glass. Somewhere on the street outside, a sprinkler system kicked on the way they always did in Los Feliz at 5 in the morning, reliable as anything in this city. I set the tea in front of her and sat across the table and waited. Emily wrapped both hands around the mug. Her knuckles were dry, the skin cracked at 2 of the joints, the kind of thing that happens when a person stops remembering to take care of small things because they are using everything they have on larger ones. "He left on a Monday," she said. "He told me it was a project in Phoenix. A mixed-use development, last-minute complications. He said he would be back by the weekend at the latest." "Did he say who the client was?" "He mentioned a name. I do not remember it now." She looked at the surface of her tea. "I did not think to write it down." "That is fine. Keep going." The first 2 days were okay. I heated up the food he left, I watched television, I worked on a design project from the couch, with my foot up the way the doctor said. She paused. On Wednesday I tried to call him. He answered but said he was walking into a meeting and would call me back. He never did. "Did you call again?" 3 more times that day. It went to voicemail. Emily's jaw tightened. On Thursday morning, he sent a text. It said, "Stop worrying, everything is fine. I will explain when I get back." I kept my hands flat on the table. "What did you text back?" I asked him when he was coming home. She swallowed. He read it. He did not answer. The kettle on the stove behind me had gone cold. I had forgotten to pour my own cup. I did not get up to fix it. Thursday was when the charger became a problem. Emily continued. Her voice had flattened into something careful and measured the voice of a person reporting facts, because facts are easier to say out loud than feelings. My phone was down to 11%. I went through every drawer, every cabinet, the basket by the door, the nightstand, the office. She stopped. The office was locked. He locks it regularly. He started about 8 months ago. He said it was because he had sensitive client documents. She said it without any particular tone. I never questioned it. I thought about that lock. I thought about a man who plans far enough ahead to start locking doors 8 months before he needs them locked. Friday morning, I was at 4%, Emily said. I plugged my laptop in and tried to transfer some charge, but the cable was not compatible. By Friday afternoon, the phone was dead. She looked up at me for the first time in several minutes. I did not know your number by heart, Dad. I realized that on Friday afternoon. I have called you my entire life, and I did not know the digits. Something moved through my chest that I did not try to identify. Nobody knows numbers anymore, I said. That is not your fault. I wrote it down once in a notebook, she said. In college, in case of emergency. A short, painful sound escaped her that was almost a laugh. I could not find the notebook either. So Friday, you could not reach anyone. I could not reach anyone. She pressed her lips together. I thought about going next door, but Jason had told me the neighbors were traveling, and the couple on the other side, I do not know them well enough to knock at that hour. She touched the bandage on her foot absently. I thought about walking to the store at the end of the block, but my foot was bad and I did not want to. She stopped again. You did not want to, what? Emily looked out the window. The sprinklers had stopped. A mockingbird had started up somewhere in the bottlebrush tree at the edge of the yard, running through its catalog of borrowed songs. I did not want anyone to see me like that, she said quietly. Alone. Unable to manage something as simple as being at home by myself for a week. I kept thinking, this is embarrassing. A grown woman who cannot handle a few days alone. She turned back to me, and her eyes were bright with something that had gone past tears into a place beyond them. Jason always said I made things bigger than they were. I stood up from the table. I walked to the sink and turned on the cold water and ran it over my wrists the way Carol used to when she needed to think without breaking something. Then I turned it off and dried my hands on the dish towel hanging from the oven handle. Emily, I said carefully. Jason did not go to Phoenix. She watched me. I do not know where he went, but I am going to find out. I picked up my phone from the counter. There is someone I need to call. His name is Dale Whitfield. He is going to help me understand some things. I looked at my daughter across the kitchen Carol had never cooked in. But first I need you to tell me one more thing. Okay. How long has your foot actually been injured? Emily's hands tightened around the cold mug. Outside, the mockingbird stopped mid-song, as if it too was waiting for the answer. Emily did not answer right away. She turned the mug in her hands, rotating it slowly, the way a person does when they are deciding how much truth fits inside a single conversation. Then she said, about a month before he left. A month. I pulled the chair back out and sat down across from her again. What happened? She told me about the argument. She had found messages on Jason's second phone, the one he kept in the inner pocket of his gym bag, and said was for work contacts only. The messages were not from work contacts. She had confronted him in the kitchen on a Tuesday evening, and Jason had listened to her with the particular stillness of a man who has already decided how the conversation will end. He had not shouted. He had not apologized. He had taken 2 steps toward her, and she had taken 1 step back and misjudged the distance to the top of the staircase, and then she had not been standing anymore. He pushed you, I said. Emily's fingers stopped moving on the mug. I lost my balance. I looked at my daughter. She looked back at me with eyes that were steady in the way that things are steady when they have been held in place by force for a very long time. Emily, he took me to urgent care the next morning, she said. He was very kind to the nurse. He explained that I had tripped going downstairs in the dark. He said I was always doing things like that, not looking where I was going. She set the mug down. The nurse looked at me once, and I smiled at her, and she wrote down what Jason said. I stood up from the table because I needed to do something with my body that was not sitting still. I walked to the counter and stood there with my back to Emily for a moment, both hands flat on the tile, and I breathed. Carol had always said I processed things physically before I processed them emotionally. She said I was like a building that way. Structural first, everything else second. I turned around. I want to look at your medication. Emily blinked. Why, humor me. The bathroom cabinet held 3 prescription bottles and 1 over-the-counter pain reliever. I carried all 4 back to the kitchen table and set them down in the light from the window. The over-the-counter bottle was fine. 2 of the prescription bottles matched their labels without question. The third was the one that stopped me. The label read the name of a standard anti-inflammatory, the kind prescribed after joint injuries to reduce swelling and allow movement. I had seen Carol take the same medication after her knee surgery in 2014. I knew what those pills looked like. Small, oval, pale yellow. The pills inside this bottle were round and white. I set the bottle down carefully on the table between us. Emily, when did Jason refill this prescription for you? She thought about it. About 6 weeks ago. He picked it up from the pharmacy. He said the doctor had switched the manufacturer, that sometimes the appearance changes, but the medication is the same. Did he show you the receipt? No. A line appeared between her eyebrows. I did not ask for one. I picked up my phone and called the after-hours nurse line for Emily's primary care physician. I had the number because I had insisted Emily give it to me when she moved to Los Angeles, the same way I had insisted on knowing her landlord's number, her building's emergency contact, and the nearest urgent care to every apartment she had ever rented. Emily had called me paranoid. Carol had called me prepared. The nurse who answered was named Patricia. I described the bottle, the label, the pills inside. I asked her to pull Emily's prescription history. Patricia put me on hold for 4 minutes. When she came back, her voice had changed in a specific way that medical professionals have when information has shifted from routine to not routine. Mr. Calloway, the anti-inflammatory on file for your daughter, is a pale yellow oval tablet. The manufacturer has not changed. There have been no generic substitutions authorized on this account. Thank you, Patricia. I ended the call and looked at Emily. My daughter stared at the bottle on the table between us. Her face had gone the particular white of someone whose body has understood something before their mind has finished processing it. Her hand came up slowly and touched the bottle without picking it up. The way you touch something you are not sure is real. He told me the pills might make me a little drowsy at first, she said. He said that was normal, that it would pass. She pressed 2 fingers against her mouth. I have been drowsy for 6 weeks, Dad. I thought I was just not sleeping well. I thought I was. She stopped. I kept forgetting things. Words, appointments. I thought I was losing my mind. You were not losing your mind. He said I seemed scattered. He said it in front of his colleagues once at dinner. He said Emily has been a little scattered lately. You know how she gets. Her voice cracked on the last 4 words, and she pulled it back under control immediately, the way someone does when they have practiced not falling apart in front of people. I believed him. I thought he was right. I put the bottle into a zip-closed sandwich bag I found in the drawer beside the stove. I sealed it and set it on the counter away from everything else. First piece of evidence, handled without fingerprints. I had not planned to think that way when I walked through Emily's front door 6 hours ago, but I was thinking that way now. My phone buzzed on the table. Dale Whitfield calling back. I picked up. Dale! Richard. Dale's voice was the same as it had always been, low and unhurried, the voice of a man who had learned to be careful with words after spending 2 years learning what careless words could cost. I ran the name you texted me. Jason Mercer, Commercial Real Estate, Los Angeles. A pause. Richard, I know this man. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a car started on the street and pulled away. Tell me, I said. Dale Whitfield arrived at 10:15 with a worn leather satchel, a slight limp from an old knee injury he had never bothered to have properly looked at, and the particular expression of a man who has been carrying a specific weight for a long time and has finally been given somewhere to set it down. He was 58 years old, trim with close-cut gray hair and the kind of permanent furrow between his eyebrows that comes not from anger, but from years of reading numbers that did not add up. I had known Dale for 22 years. We had met on a commercial project in Culver City when he was an independent auditor and I was the structural engineer, and we had stayed in each other's lives the way people do when they recognize in another person a similar commitment to getting things right. I introduced him to Emily at the door. Dale shook her hand and said, "Your father speaks about you constantly. I feel like I already know you." Emily managed a small smile that did not reach her eyes, and Dale did not push for more than that. He was good at reading rooms. We sat at the kitchen table. I had made fresh coffee. Dale opened his satchel and laid 3 folders on the table in a neat row, then folded his hands on top of them and looked at me. "Shoti, 8 years ago," he said. "I was a minority partner in a small investment firm in Burbank. We handled mid-market commercial acquisitions, nothing spectacular but solid work. Jason Mercer came in as a consultant on 2 deals. Dale's voice stayed level and unhurried. He was good. Genuinely good. That was the thing that made it work. He knew the language, he knew the numbers, and he knew exactly how to make you feel like the smartest person in the room for trusting him." Emily set her coffee mug down without drinking from it. "Over 14 months. Dale continued. "Jason moved a series of high-risk transactions through accounts that were nominally mine. Not my signature on everything, not my knowledge on anything. He used a limited power of attorney I had signed in the 2nd month of our working relationship, a standard document that authorized him to execute routine transactions on behalf of the firm." Dale opened the first folder and slid a page across to me. "This is what a limited power of attorney looks like when someone intends to use it beyond its stated purpose." I looked at the document. Then I looked at Dale. "He ran bad transactions through your accounts using your authorization. 17 of them over 14 months. When the firm's investors started asking questions, every trail led to my signature or my authorization code." Dale closed the folder. "I spent 11 months and most of my savings proving I had not known what was being signed in my name. The firm dissolved. 2 of my colleagues lost their retirement accounts." He paused. "Jason was never charged. There was not enough direct evidence to overcome the documentation he had created." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past on Arcadia Boulevard, and the windows trembled slightly in their frames. "I need to show you something," I said. I went to Emily's filing cabinet in the small office off the hallway, the one room in the house where the door had been left unlocked in Jason's absence, and retrieved the folder of property documents I had found that morning. I brought it back to the table and set it in front of Dale. He put on his reading glasses and went through the pages slowly. He did not react visibly to anything he read, which was itself a reaction. Dale only went still like that when something was worse than he had expected. After 6 minutes, he looked up. "Richard, this property was used as collateral for a business loan taken out 14 months ago. The loan is currently in default." He turned 2 pages and set them side by side. "And this document, the one authorizing full disposition of the property, was signed by Emily. Emily leaned forward. "What document?" Dale turned it toward her. It was a single page, dense with legal language, with Emily's signature at the bottom in the slightly uneven handwriting of someone who was not entirely focused when they signed. Emily stared at it. Her face went through several things quickly. "I have never seen this before." "Do you recognize the signature?" I asked. "It looks like mine." She pressed her fingers against her temple. But I did not. I would not have signed something like this without reading it. I always read everything before I sign. She looked up at me, and her eyes held a specific kind of horror that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the realization that her own name had been used against her while she was not fully herself. "The pills," she said. "Yes," I said. Dale set his glasses on the table. "Emily, do you remember signing any documents in the last 6 to 8 weeks? Anything Jason put in front of you, even something he described as routine?" Emily's face contracted. She pressed both hands flat against the table and stared at the surface, and I could see her working backward through 6 weeks of medicated days, trying to find the edges of things that had blurred together. Then something shifted in her expression. "There was something," she said slowly. "He said it was an insurance update. He said the policy required a signature from both of us, but that he had already signed his portion and just needed mine on one line." She looked at the document Dale had turned toward her. He had his hand over most of the page. He said the rest was just standard language. I picked up my phone. I needed to call Detective Brenda Okafor. I had not spoken to Brenda in 3 years, but I had her number, and I believed she would answer, because Brenda Okafor was the kind of person who answered. But before I dialed, Emily said, "Dad." Something in her voice made me set the phone back down. "There is something else," she said. "Something I have not told you yet." She looked at her hands on the table. Her fingers were trembling now with the fine, persistent tremor of someone who has held themselves together, past the point where holding on makes sense. "I need you to know that I did not just wait. While all of this was happening, I was not only waiting. I looked at my daughter. "I have something," she said. "I have had it for months. I did not know if I would ever need it, or if you would ever come home, or if I was imagining all of it." She pulled in a slow breath. "But I kept it anyway. Because you always said, Emily, document everything. You said it about contracts, about job sites, about everything. You said it so many times I stopped hearing it." She looked up at me. "And then one day I needed it to be true." Dale left at noon with the property documents photographed and catalogued, and the Ziploc bag containing Emily's medication secured in his satchel for independent testing. He shook my hand at the door and said quietly enough that Emily could not hear from the kitchen, "Richard, he has done this before, and he will do it again if nothing stops him. Whatever you need from me, I am here." Then he walked to his car with that careful gait of his and drove away. And I stood on the front step for a moment in the Los Angeles midday heat and thought about the word, whatever. Whatever you need. I had not yet let myself think about how large that word might have to be. Emily was on the couch when I came back inside her foot, elevated on 2 throw pillows, a glass of water on the side table that she had not touched. She had stopped taking the white pills that morning. I had told her we needed to know how she felt without them, and she had agreed with the quiet compliance of someone who had been agreeing with instructions for so long that agreeing had become its own kind of reflex. That would take time to undo. I understood that. "Emily," I said, "where is your old phone? The one before the one Jason gave you?" She looked up. "In my dresser." Top drawer right side. Why? I want to look at something. The old phone was a model 2 years behind current. The screen slightly scuffed at one corner. The case a dark green that Emily had picked. Because she had told me when she bought it, it reminded her of the color of the front door of the house she grew up in. Carol had painted that door the summer Emily turned 12. Neither of them had consulted me about the color, and I had pretended to have opinions about it for years, purely for the entertainment value. The phone still held a charge. I carried it back to the living room and sat in the chair across from Emily and plugged it into the charger I had bought at a drugstore that morning, one of 6 I had purchased and distributed through the house, so that this particular problem would not happen again. The messages loaded slowly, the backlog of 8 months accumulating in real time. There were 47 unread messages from a contact saved as Sarah H. I recognized the name. Sarah Hartwell had been Emily's closest friend since graduate school at SCI ARC, the Southern California Institute of Architecture on West Jefferson. Emily had been a bridesmaid at Sarah's wedding 4 years ago. I had met Sarah exactly 3 times, and each time she had told me with great sincerity that Emily was the most talented designer she had ever met. I had liked her immediately. I handed the phone to Emily. "Read these." Emily took it. She read for 2 minutes without speaking. Then her breath changed, the kind of change that happens just before someone cries, but when they are still deciding whether to allow it. "She thought I was ignoring her," Emily said. "Keep reading." Emily scrolled. Her jaw was working. "She reached out 8 times in the first month. Then she started spacing them out. Then she stopped. Then she sent one in December that says, I don't know what I did, but I'm sorry for it. Whatever it was, I miss you. Please just tell me you're okay." Emily put the phone face down on her knee and pressed her palm flat against it. "I never got any of these." "I know." He answered them. She said it not as a question. Some of them, the ones that needed answering so Sarah would stop trying other channels. I had already read the outgoing messages from Emily's number. Jason's responses were polished and plausible and completely consistent in tone, which told me he had been doing this long enough to have developed a voice for it. He told her you were working through some personal things, that you needed space, that you would reach out when you were ready. Emily picked up the phone again and found the outgoing messages. She read them, and the color left her face in a slow, steady way, like water draining from a glass. "He knew how I write," she said. "He used the words I use. He even." She held the phone out and pointed to a sentence. "I always say take care instead of goodbye." He knew that. 8 months. A man had spent 8 months studying the way his wife wrote text messages so that he could impersonate her, convincingly enough, to keep her friends from asking too many questions. I had built structures that required less planning than that. I called Sarah Hartwell from Emily's old phone. She answered on the second ring with the cautious hello of someone who has been surprised by a number they thought had gone quiet permanently. "Shreo." I said, "My name is Richard Calloway. I am Emily's father. I need to tell you some things, and I need you to listen before you say anything, because some of it is going to be difficult to hear." Sarah listened. She did not interrupt once. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said in a voice that was absolutely furious in the controlled way of someone who is choosing fury over falling apart. "I knew something was wrong. I knew it. He called me once. Did Emily tell you that he called me directly and said she was seeing a therapist and that the therapist had recommended limiting contact with people who created anxiety? He said I was on that list." A short, sharp sound. I almost believed him. I almost. She stopped. "How is she right now?" I looked at Emily across the room. My daughter was sitting with the old green-cased phone in her lap, reading through 8 months of messages from a friend who had never stopped reaching out, her face doing the complicated, painful work of understanding simultaneously that she had been isolated and that she had not been forgotten. "She is going to be all right," I said. "But she needs to hear from you. Can you call her directly when we hang up?" "I am already in my car," Sarah said. I ended the call and set the phone on the arm of the chair. Emily looked up at me. Her eyes were red and her chin was unsteady, and she said she did not forget about me. "No," I said. "She did not." Emily pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth and held it there. Outside on Arcadia Boulevard, the afternoon traffic was picking up the ordinary sounds of a city that did not know or care what was happening inside this particular house on this particular day. I thought about Jason somewhere with his phone answering whatever messages required. Managing whatever version of events he had constructed, entirely confident that the walls he had built around my daughter were still standing. He did not know I was home yet. That was still mine to use. Sarah arrived at 4 in the afternoon with 2 paper bags of groceries, a box of chamomile tea, and the specific energy of a woman who has converted grief into logistics, because logistics are something you can actually do something about. She and Emily held on to each other in the doorway for a long time, without either of them saying anything that needed words, and I went to the kitchen and put away the groceries, because it gave them privacy, and because I needed something to do with my hands that was not making a fist. I left them in the living room and sat at the kitchen table with my phone and the photographs I had taken of every document in the house. I went through them one by one. The property records, the insurance modification, Jason's handwritten instructions, the medication bottle. I organized them into a folder and sent copies to Dale and to the email address I had created that morning on a platform Jason had no access to. When Sarah left an hour later, she squeezed my arm at the door and said, "She told me about you. She said you always show up." She said it like a statement of fact rather than a compliment, which was the best way anyone had ever said anything like that to me. Emily was quieter after Sarah left. Not the frightened quiet of the previous days, but a different kind, the quiet of someone who has been reminded that they exist to people who are not the person trying to make them disappear. She sat with her foot up and her hands in her lap, and after a while she said, "Dad, do you want to know about the stairs?" I put my phone face down on the table. "Only if you want to tell me." She looked at the window. The evening light was coming through the glass at a low angle the way it did in Los Angeles in March, when the sun dropped early and the shadows stretched long across the floors. Emily watched the light for a moment, and then she began. "I found the second phone on a Wednesday," she said. "It was in his gym bag in the inside pocket. I had never looked there before. I did not have a reason to look there before." Her voice was even and careful in a way that took effort. "I waited until he came home that evening. I put the phone on the kitchen counter and I said, 'Jason, what is this?' What did he do?" He looked at the phone. Then he looked at me. And he smiled. She turned from the window to face me. Not a guilty smile. Not a caught smile. Just a smile. Like I had said something mildly interesting at a dinner party. Her hands tightened in her lap. "He said, 'That is a work phone, Emily. I have told you about it.' And I said, 'I have read the messages on it, Jason.'" And the smile went away. I kept my hands flat on the table. "He did not shout," Emily continued. "He never shouts. He just gets very quiet and very still, and the room changes when he does that. The way a room changes when the pressure drops before a storm." She pressed her thumbnail into her palm. "He walked toward me and I stepped back, and I did not realize I was at the top of the stairs, until I was not at the top of the stairs anymore. He pushed you. Emily's jaw tightened. He put his hand on my shoulder. She said it with the careful precision of someone who has rehearsed the distinction until it felt like accuracy. And then I was falling. I breathed in through my nose and out through my mouth and did not say what I was thinking. "The landing at the bottom is hardwood," Emily said. I put my hand out and my wrist caught it wrong and my foot twisted underneath me. I heard something pop in my ankle and the pain was... She stopped, pressed her lips together. It was very bad. "What did Jason do?" "He came down the stairs. He crouched beside me." She looked at her hands. "And he took out his phone and he started recording." The kitchen light hummed above us. Outside, a dog was barking 2 houses down 3 short barks, and then silence, the kind of neighborhood dog that announces things and then loses interest. He said in a very calm voice, "Tell me what happened." And I was on the floor with my foot at the wrong angle, and I was trying not to make any sound, because making sound felt like losing something I could not afford to lose. Emily's voice dropped, and he said it again. "Emily, tell me what happened." And I said I fell. Because it was easier to say, and because he was still recording, and because I did not know what he would do if I said something else. "He threatened you," he said. She stopped, started again. "He said that if I made this into something it was not, he would make sure everyone who mattered to me understood exactly what kind of person I was. He used the word unstable. He said, you know how you get, Emily. You know what people will think." She looked up at me and her eyes were dry and burning. He said it so reasonably. That was the worst part. He said it the way you would explain something to a child who was confused about a simple thing. I stood up from the table. I walked to the sink and ran cold water over my wrists the way Carol had taught me. I stood there until my hands stopped doing what they wanted to do and started doing what I needed them to do. When I turned around, Emily was watching me. "Dad," she said. "I kept the video." I went very still. He recorded it on his phone, but I had my laptop open on the couch above the landing. I had been working. The camera was running. She held my gaze and her voice was the steadiest it had been all day. "I have the original. The whole thing. Before he started recording. Before he told me what to say." I looked at my daughter sitting in her kitchen with her injured foot and her dry, burning eyes and the particular straightness of a woman who had been waiting a very long time to say something out loud to someone who would not use it against her. "Where is it?" I asked. "In my drafting kit," she said. "Along with everything else." The drafting kit was a large, flat case in olive canvas, the kind that architecture students carry rolled under one arm across studio floors at 2 in the morning. Emily had owned it since her second year at SCI Arc. It had her initials stamped in the lower right corner in gold letters that had faded to a dull bronze, and it smelled of graphite and fixative spray and the specific accumulated history of a person who had spent years making things with her hands before someone convinced her that what she made did not matter. She carried it to the kitchen table and set it down and unzipped the main compartment. Inside, beneath a layer of tracing paper and a rolled set of elevation drawings, was a small external hard drive in a padded sleeve and a USB drive no larger than a thumbnail secured with a rubber band to a folded sheet of notebook paper covered in Emily's handwriting. She set both items on the table between us. Then she sat down and folded her hands and said, "I want to explain before you look at anything." "Go ahead." "I found the second phone in June," she said. "The night I confronted him. Before the stairs. Before any of the rest of it." She touched the edge of the notebook paper without unfolding it. The next morning, while he was at the gym, I went to his car. I had a small recording device. I had ordered it online 3 weeks earlier because I had already suspected something was wrong and I did not know what else to do. She looked up at me. I know how that sounds. It sounds like good judgment, I said. California law allows a person to record a conversation they are participating in without informing the other party. She said, with the careful precision of someone who had looked this up and memorized it. I am not a lawyer, but I read everything I could find before I did it. I needed to know I was not breaking a law to catch someone breaking everything else. One-party consent. She was correct. Under California Penal Code Section 632, a person may record any conversation to which they are a party without the knowledge of the other participants provided. The recording party is present. Emily had done her homework in the worst months of her life alone, in a house with a locked office and pills that were not her pills, and she had still found a way to be precise. The device records automatically when there is sound in the vehicle, Emily continued. I retrieved it every 2 weeks when Jason took his morning runs. I transferred the files to the hard drive and replaced the device before he came back. She paused. He never noticed. He does not think I understand technology. He told me once that I was charmingly analog. A brief, flat expression crossed her face. I let him think that. I picked up the hard drive and looked at it. The most important file is labeled November 14th, Emily said. Jason was on the phone for 40 minutes driving to a meeting in Century City. The other person's name is Samantha. I plugged the hard drive into Emily's laptop. The November 14th file was 2 hours and 17 minutes long. I found the section Emily had flagged with a timestamp written on the notebook paper and pressed play. Jason's voice filled the small kitchen speaker, relaxed and unhurried, the voice of a man entirely comfortable with what he was saying, because he believed he was alone. He was talking about Emily. He used her name twice and then stopped using it, switching to a pronoun that made my jaw tighten. He told Samantha the timeline was moving faster than expected. He said the property situation would resolve itself once certain signatures were in place. He said the old man, which I understood to mean me, was conveniently occupied and unlikely to ask the right questions before it was too late. Then he said something that I made myself listen to twice to be certain I had heard it correctly. He said she thinks the pills are making her better. That is the beauty of it. She is grateful. Samantha laughed on the recording. It was not a happy laugh. It was the laugh of someone participating in something they found impressive rather than funny. I closed the laptop. Emily was watching me. Her face was very still, and her hands were flat on the table, and she was holding herself together with the particular rigidity of someone who has listened to that file enough times that the shock has worn away and left something harder underneath. "How many times have you heard this?" I asked. "Enough," she said. I picked up my phone and called Dale. He answered on the first ring. I told him about the hard drive and the November 14th file without editorializing the way you describe the dimensions of a structural problem before you propose a solution. Dale was quiet through all of it. When I finished, he said, "Richard, with the property documents, the medication, and this recording, you have enough to go to law enforcement." "Not maybe enough." "Enough. I know," I said. "But I want to do this correctly. I want every door closed before we open the one we cannot close again." Dale was quiet for a moment. "You are thinking about the man in the contract?" "Yes." "You want him to hand you the last piece himself?" "Yes." Another pause. Then Dale said, "I know someone at the Economic Crimes Division. Detective, very good, very thorough. She has worked financial fraud and dependent adult cases. Her name is Brenda Okafor. I wrote the name on the back of the notebook paper Emily had given me. Then I looked across the table at my daughter, who had spent 4 months recording conversations in a car and transferring files to a hard drive and waiting for a day that she was not entirely certain would come. "Emily," I said. "Yeah. You did exactly right." She pressed her lips together hard and looked at the ceiling and blinked several times rapidly. Then she looked back at me and said with a steadiness that cost her something, "I learned from somebody." I picked up my phone and dialed Brenda Okafor. Brenda Okafor arrived at Dale's office on Wilshire Boulevard at 9 the next morning, carrying a legal pad, a travel mug of coffee she did not offer to share, and the unhurried authority of a woman who has spent 2 decades being the most prepared person in any room she walks into. She was 53 medium height, with close-cropped natural hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead that she never seemed to actually use for reading. She wore a dark blazer over a gray shirt and no jewelry except a watch with a wide leather band. She shook my hand when Dale introduced us and said, "Richard Calloway. Dale has told me about you. 40 years in structural engineering, never lost an arbitration, built half of Silver Lake." She sat down and opened her legal pad. "Let us see if that record holds." I liked her immediately. Dale had arranged his office for the meeting with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that the way information is presented is almost as important as the information itself. The documents were organized in 3 stacks. The hard drive sat beside Dale's laptop. The Ziploc bag with Emily's medication was in a paper evidence envelope Dale had obtained from a contact at a local pharmacy, properly sealed and labeled with the date and time of collection. Brenda went through everything without speaking for 18 minutes. She listened to 4 sections of the November 14th recording, pausing and rewinding twice at the section where Jason discussed the property timeline. She examined the signature document Emily had signed under the influence of the substituted medication. She read Dale's written summary of the financial transactions he had identified, running through accounts associated with Richard's business authorization. Then she set her legal pad down and looked at me. "Mr. Calloway, I want to be direct with you because I find that saves everyone time." She folded her hands on the table. "What you have brought me today is sufficient to open a formal investigation under California Penal Code 368 dependent adult abuse and Penal Code 532 fraud. The recording establishes intent. The medication establishes deliberate harm. The property documents establish financial exploitation." She paused. "What I cannot promise you is an arrest on the strength of what exists right now. A good defense attorney looks at this and argues the recording is circumstantial. The medication substitution lacks a direct chain of custody to your son-in-law, and the signature was obtained through manipulation that is difficult to prove beyond reasonable doubt without your daughter testifying to her mental state during a period when she was, by the defense's argument, simply unwell." The room was quiet for a moment. A city bus moved past on Wilshire below the window, and the sound came up faint and muffled through the glass. "You need him to do something provable in the present," I said. "I need him to hand me something I can hold," Brenda said. "Yes." Dale cleared his throat. "Richard has a proposal." Brenda looked at me. I had spent the previous evening after Emily went to sleep, sitting at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad of my own, working through the proposal the way I worked through structural problems. Identify the load. Identify the weak point. Design the transfer so the weight goes exactly where you need it to go. "Jason needs me," I said. "Specifically, he needs my continued cooperation and my continued ignorance. He has been managing me the same way he manages everyone, which is to say carefully and from a distance, giving me just enough to keep me passive." I set my own notes on the table. I am going to stop being passive in a way that looks like the opposite. I am going to call Jason today and tell him I have a new investment opportunity. Commercial property off-market, the kind of deal that requires fast movement and personal financial commitment. I am going to tell him I want to structure it with him directly, not through the company, because the tax advantages are cleaner that way. Brenda's expression did not change. You want him to sign as an individual? I want him to sign as an individual on a document that Dale has prepared with a personal guarantee clause making him solely and completely liable for all financial obligations associated with the deal. No corporate shield, no limited liability. His name and his name only on every line that matters. I looked at Brenda. When he signs that document in front of witnesses, you have him doing precisely what he planned to do to me in real time with full documentation. Brenda picked up her pen and wrote something on her legal pad. And the existing debts he attempted to transfer to your name through the earlier authorization. Dale has already drafted a corrective instrument that nullifies the scope of the original authorization and limits it to its stated purpose. We file that the same day Jason signs the new agreement. His liability is forward and backward simultaneously. Dale nodded once. He had reviewed the instrument the night before and found it sound. Brenda set her pen down. Mr. Calloway, if we move forward with this, you understand that you are the instrument of the operation. You will be in that room with him. You will need to be entirely convincing, not merely adequate. Convincing. She looked at me steadily. If he suspects anything, he walks, and everything we have built becomes harder to prosecute because his attorney argues entrapment. I thought about Jason's voice on the November 14th recording. Relaxed, unhurried, entirely confident that the people around him were manageable. He does not think I am capable of this, I said. He has decided I am a useful old man who builds things and trusts the wrong people and can be handled with a Rolex and a firm handshake. I picked up my coffee cup. I have been letting him think that. I intend to keep letting him think it until the moment it stops being useful. Brenda looked at me for a long moment. Then she wrote something else on her legal pad and said, Dale will get me the draft agreement by Thursday. I will have my team review it and prepare the supporting documentation. She closed the pad and stood. Mr. Calloway, I need you to do one more thing before we proceed. Name it. Go home to your daughter, Brenda said, and do not change a single thing about how you behave toward Jason Mercer until I tell you it is time. I drove back to Emily's house in the late morning sun with all 4 windows down because the Santa Ana winds had come in overnight, and the air smelled of dry grass and distant smoke. The particular smell of Los Angeles in the weeks before everything either burns or does not, and I thought about what 40 years of building things had actually taught me. It had taught me that the most important structural element is never the one you can see. I had known Jason Mercer for 4 years, 2 months, and approximately 16 days. I had shaken his hand at a restaurant in Los Feliz on a Sunday afternoon when Emily brought him to meet me for the first time, and I had thought, this is a man who has practiced his handshake. Firm without aggression, held exactly 1 beat longer than necessary. The handshake of a man who understands that first impressions are infrastructure. I had liked him then. That was the part that sat heaviest now. He pulled into the driveway at 3:47 in the afternoon in the black SUV Emily had told me he drove, and I watched from the living room window as he stepped out wearing a linen shirt, the color of sand, and sunglasses that probably cost more than my first car. He was tan in the specific way of someone who has spent a week on open water, the kind of tan that does not come from a pool or a patio, but from standing on the deck of something expensive with the sun hitting you from every angle at once. He reached back into the SUV for a garment bag and a carry-on, and did not look toward the house until he had both handles in his hands. Then he looked up and saw my car in the driveway and went still for exactly 2 seconds before he started walking toward the front door. 2 seconds. I noted it. I was sitting in the armchair closest to the window when he came in, the one Emily usually sat in to read, which meant I was in the chair that faced the door, and he would see me the moment he crossed the threshold. I had chosen it deliberately. After 40 years of negotiating contracts, I had learned that the person who is already seated when the other party arrives controls the first 30 seconds of every interaction. 30 seconds is enough. Richard. Jason set his bags down near the entry and extended his hand. His smile arrived at the correct speed. Not too fast, which would signal nervousness, and not too slow, which would signal calculation. Right in the middle, which signaled practice. I did not know you were back in town. Wrapped up early, I said. I stood and shook his hand. Firm. One beat. Exactly what he expected. Emily mentioned you were coming home today. I wanted to be here. Of course. He glanced toward the stairs. How is she? Resting, I said. Her foot has been bothering her. We went to see her doctor yesterday morning. I watched his face as I said it and saw the smallest recalibration behind his eyes, the tiny internal adjustment of a man updating his estimate of how much I knew. They want her to stay off it for another 2 weeks. I should have been here. He said it with exactly the right amount of regret. Not excessive, which would be unconvincing. Just enough to land. The project ran longer than I expected, and the communication situation out there was a nightmare. I felt terrible about leaving her. These things happen, I said. He went to the kitchen, and I followed. And he opened the refrigerator and looked at its contents, and I watched the back of his neck while he did it. The refrigerator was full. I had stocked it 2 days ago with the deliberate thoroughness of a man who intended to stay. He would notice that. He would file it. You have been keeping her company, he said, still looking at the refrigerator. Fathers do that, I said. He closed the refrigerator and turned around, and leaned against the counter with his arms crossed in a posture that was relaxed without being careless. He was good. I gave him that. He was genuinely, impressively good at the surface of things. Richard, he said, I owe you an apology. I should have had better backup arrangements in place for Emily while I was away. It will not happen again. I appreciate that, I said. He nodded and pushed off the counter and went to his garment bag by the door and unzipped the outer pocket. He came back to the kitchen holding a flat rectangular box in dark green with a cream ribbon. He set it on the kitchen table between us. I picked this up in Dubai, he said. A small thank you for always being supportive, Richard. It means more than you know having your trust. I looked at the box. Then I looked at Jason. His expression was open and warm and entirely constructed. I picked up the box and opened it. The watch inside was a Rolex Datejust, stainless steel case silver dial Jubilee bracelet. Retail value somewhere in the neighborhood of $8,000. I knew because I had looked it up the evening before on the reasonable assumption that Jason would arrive with something that needed to be looked up. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands. On the case, back in the curved script favored by men who commission personal engravings on gifts they intend to be remembered for, were 4 words. With gratitude and respect. I put the watch on my wrist. I fastened the clasp. I held my wrist up and looked at it the way a man looks at a watch he is genuinely pleased to receive. Jason, I said, this is too much. Not at all. He was watching my wrist, watching me wear it, watching me accept it. I could see the small, private satisfaction working behind his expression, the satisfaction of a man who has just confirmed a hypothesis he was already confident about. You deserve it. Well, I set my wrist down on the table and looked at him with the straightforward warmth of a father-in-law who has just been reminded why he trusted this man in the first place. Thank you. Truly, he smiled. His shoulders dropped a quarter inch. The room changed the way rooms change when a person decides they are safe. I thought about the November 14th recording. I thought about the word grateful and the way he had used it. She thinks the pills are making her better. That is the beauty of it. She is grateful. I kept the smile on my face. I kept my hands still on the table. I kept my voice at exactly the temperature it needed to be. Actually, I said, there is something I have been wanting to discuss with you. A business matter. Something I think you will find interesting. I leaned back in my chair like a man with nothing but good news to deliver. I came across an opportunity last week. Off-market commercial parcels, strong fundamentals, and I think the structure of the deal would suit you particularly well. Jason's eyes sharpened with an interest he could not entirely keep casual. Tell me more. Upstairs, I heard Emily move across the floor of her room. A door opened and closed softly. I did not look up at the ceiling. I did not change anything about my face. Not tonight, I said pleasantly. Tonight you rest. We can sit down properly later this week. Jason nodded. He was already thinking about it. I could see him thinking about it. That was exactly what I needed him to do. Jason cooked the way he did everything else with a competence so deliberate, it felt like a performance. He had stopped at the Whole Foods on Hyperion on the way back from unpacking his bags, come home with a paper bag of groceries he set on the counter with the quiet satisfaction of a man demonstrating that he thinks of things, and by 7 o'clock, the kitchen smelled of garlic and white wine, and the specific variety of effort that is designed to be noticed. Carol had cooked without wanting anyone to notice. She had cooked the way she did most things fully and without audience, and the food had been extraordinary because she cared about the food and not about being seen caring about it. I thought about that while I watched Jason arrange 3 plates on the counter with the symmetry of a man who has read about plating technique. I thought about Carol a lot in that kitchen. Emily came downstairs at 7:15, moving carefully on her foot, one hand on the wall at the bottom of the stairs. Jason looked up from the stove when he heard her and said, "There she is. Sit down, don't put weight on it." His voice was warm and solicitous, and I watched Emily's face do the thing it did when she received his consideration, a small, involuntary softening that was not happiness, but the memory of when she had believed it was. She sat at the table. I sat across from her. Jason brought the plates over and opened a bottle of red wine from the rack above the refrigerator and poured 2 glasses without asking, and set one in front of me and one in front of his own place, and then looked at Emily's empty space at the table. "You are still on the medication," he said. Not a question. "Better not to mix it." Emily nodded without looking up. I picked up my wine glass and held it but did not drink from it. The meal began. Jason talked about Dubai the way people talk about places they want you to know they can afford. He described the hotel, the dinner he had at a restaurant on the 75th floor of something the boat trip he had taken through the marina. He mentioned a client he had met, a developer with interests across the Gulf region, a potential relationship that could open significant doors. He spoke with the fluency of a man whose story has been prepared in advance and rehearsed until it sounds spontaneous. I said the right things at the right intervals. That sounds promising. What was the project scope? Did the time difference give you trouble? Emily ate quietly and did not ask questions. 15 minutes into the meal, Jason refilled his own wine glass and looked at Emily's plate and said, "You have barely touched it." "I am not very hungry." "You are never hungry lately." He said it lightly, the way you observe something affectionately. "No wonder you have no energy." He cut a piece of his chicken and ate it, and added still in the same pleasant tone, "You really should try to eat more, Emily. It is hard to recover when you are not fueling yourself properly." Emily moved a piece of food on her plate from one side to the other. She has been eating well," I said. "We have been cooking together the last few days. She made eggs this morning." Jason looked at me with an expression of warm agreement that did not reach past his cheekbones. "That is great. Good for you, Richard, getting her back on track." Getting her back on track. As if Emily were a project that had gone sideways and required management. I set my fork down and picked it back up. 30 minutes in, Jason began talking about Emily's work. He mentioned casually as a footnote to something else that she had been meaning to get back to her freelance projects, but that the timing had never quite been right. That she was better suited to smaller residential work anyway, nothing too demanding. He said it the way people say things they have said many times before, worn smooth by repetition into something that sounds like fact. Emily's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Her fork touched her plate with a small, precise click. "Emily has 3 award citations from the California Council," I said. "The residential project in Pasadena she completed in 2022 won regional recognition for adaptive reuse design." I said it conversationally, the way you correct a minor factual error at a dinner table. "I keep the documentation in my office. I have shown it to clients when they ask whether her work meets a certain standard." I looked at Jason pleasantly. "It always exceeds it." Something moved across Jason's face, quick and controlled, gone before most people would have caught it. But I had been watching his face for 4 days with the specific attention of a structural engineer looking for the hairline crack in a load-bearing wall. "Of course," he said. "I am her biggest supporter. I just meant the bigger commercial work can be stressful with everything she has been managing health-wise." "She is managing very well," I said. The table went quiet for a moment, in the way tables go quiet when something has been said that cannot be unsaid, but that no one is ready to address directly. Jason picked up his wine. Emily looked at her plate. I looked at Jason. He smiled at me over the rim of his glass. I smiled back. Carol had told me once, "You have a smile that tells people exactly nothing, Richard." She had meant it as a criticism. I had always considered it a professional asset. After dinner, Jason offered to clear the table, and I let him. And while he ran water at the sink, I helped Emily to the couch and sat on the cushion beside her. And she leaned very slightly toward me, less than an inch, the way a building shifts its weight toward the structure it trusts to hold. She did not say anything about what had happened at the table. She did not need to. What I had seen tonight was not an argument or an accusation or even a confrontation. It was a demonstration. A man showing me without realizing he was showing me exactly what my daughter came home to every day. The managed portions, the redirected compliments, the way he held the ceiling just low enough that standing up straight was not possible. In the kitchen, Jason was humming something tuneless while he stacked dishes. I looked at the Rolex on my wrist. The weight of it felt different than it had this afternoon. Not heavier exactly, more specific. I had 3 days before the meeting with Dale to finalize the contract documents. 3 days before I called Jason with the details of the investment opportunity and watched him walk toward it with the confidence of a man who has never considered that the floor might not be where he thinks it is. I thought about Carol again, about what she would have said. She would have said, "Richard, stop thinking and go to bed. You cannot build anything when you are tired." She would have been right. She usually was. The call came at 7:12 in the morning, 2 days after the dinner, while I was sitting on Emily's back porch with a cup of coffee watching a pair of mockingbirds argue over the bottlebrush tree at the edge of the yard. The number was unfamiliar. Los Angeles area code, which by this point in my life I had learned to treat as a category rather than a reassurance. I answered on the second ring. Mr. Calloway. A woman's voice. Younger than I expected, with the careful enunciation of someone who has rehearsed an opening line enough times that it no longer sounds rehearsed. My name is Samantha Voss. I need to talk to you about Jason Mercer, and I need you to understand before I say anything else that I am aware of how this looks. I set my coffee cup down on the porch railing very carefully. Go ahead, Ms. Voss, I said. She told me she had been involved with Jason for 14 months. She told me she had understood from the beginning, or believed she had understood the nature of what they were doing and the terms under which it operated. She used words like arrangement and situation and working relationship, the vocabulary of someone who has built a careful distance from their own decisions. Then she said, 2 weeks ago, she had found a series of messages on Jason's phone that made it clear he had been in contact with the daughter of a real estate developer in Newport Beach, and that the contact was neither professional nor recent. He is moving on, she said. And when Jason moves on, he removes things. People, liabilities, complications. Her voice stayed controlled, but I could hear the edges of it. I have been involved in certain financial transactions over the last 14 months that were structured in ways I did not fully understand at the time. I understand them now. And I understand what happens to me when Jason decides I am a complication. Ms. Voss. I said, I want to ask you a direct question, and I need a direct answer. All right. Did you know about my daughter? A pause. Not the calculating kind. The kind that comes before something honest. I knew he was married, she said. I told myself it was his problem to manage, not mine. Another pause. I heard him on the phone once, maybe 4 months ago, talking about the property. He said she signed everything I needed her to sign. She does not even know what she agreed to. Samantha's breath came out unsteadily. I told myself I did not hear that. I was good at that for a while. I looked at the bottlebrush tree. The mockingbirds had resolved their dispute and moved on. The yard was very quiet. What do you want, Ms. Voss? I asked. I want out, she said. Completely out. I want documentation that I cooperated fully and voluntarily with any investigation, and I want that documented before anything becomes official, not after. She said it with the precision of someone who has thought through the sequence carefully. I have materials. Financial records, emails, a planning document Jason created that outlines the full timeline of what he intended to do with your daughter's property and your business authorization. And I have an audio file. What is on the audio file? Jason talking about Emily, she said. Not on the phone. In person to me in my apartment approximately 6 weeks ago. He was not careful that night. He had been drinking, and he was frustrated about a timeline delay, and he said things that he would not have said if he had been thinking clearly. She stopped. He described what he had done to her in a way that removed any ambiguity about whether it was intentional. I stood up from the porch chair and walked to the edge of the yard and back. It was a habit I had developed on job sites when I needed to think without stopping entirely. I need you to meet me today, I said, in person. Bring everything you just described. She chose a coffee shop in Silver Lake, a small place on Griffith Park Boulevard, with outdoor seating and enough ambient noise from the street that a conversation could happen without being overheard by the people at the next table. I got there first, and took the corner table facing the entrance, which was also a habit. Samantha Voss was 31 years old and looked like someone who had recently lost weight she had not intended to lose. She was professionally dressed in the way people dress when they want to be taken seriously, but are not entirely certain they deserve to be a dark blazer over a plain shirt, hair pulled back, no unnecessary jewelry. She carried a laptop bag over one shoulder and a manila envelope in her right hand, and she scanned the patio until she found me, and then walked over without hesitating, which I credited to her. She sat down and put the envelope and the laptop bag on the table between us, and said, "Before I give you any of this, I need to know what you can offer me." "I cannot offer you anything personally," I said. "I am not law enforcement, but I am in contact with a detective at the Economic Crimes Division of the Los Angeles Police Department, and she has authorized me to tell you that voluntary cooperation provided prior to formal charges, accompanied by complete disclosure, is taken into account during prosecutorial review." I looked at her steadily. "That is not immunity, but it is the difference between someone who was complicit and someone who helped stop it." Samantha looked at the envelope on the table. Then she pushed it across to me. Inside was a planning document, 11 pages, dated 8 months earlier. At the top of the first page, in a header Jason had apparently seen no reason to remove, was Emily's full name. Below it, in the clean, structured language of a man who thought in project plans, was a timeline. Property acquisition confirmation. Authorization instrument execution. Subject relocation. Asset liquidation and transfer. Subject relocation. I had built things for 40 years. I had read thousands of documents. I had never read the word subject used that way about my daughter. I closed the envelope and looked at Samantha Voss across the table. She was watching me with the expression of someone waiting to find out what the damage is after the estimate comes in. "Play me the audio file," I said. She opened her laptop and turned the volume low and pressed play. Jason's voice came out of the speaker, looser than I had heard it, the careful surface worn thinner by alcohol and irritation. He was talking about Emily. He used her name once, and then switched the way he had in the November recording to a pronoun that told me everything I needed to know about how he thought of her when no performance was required. I listened to 40 seconds. Then I held up my hand, and Samantha stopped the file. I took out my phone and called Brenda Okafor. "We have everything we need," I said when she answered. "It is time to set the date. Before I reveal how this confrontation unfolds, comment justice down below, so I know you're still standing with me here on Dad's Revenge Stories. Also, please keep in mind, the upcoming events feature dramatized storytelling elements. If this style of narrative isn't for you, feel free to step away now. Otherwise, let's see how the trap snaps shut." The meeting was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of April. Dale's office on Wilshire had a conference room on the east side of the building, with a long table, 4 leather chairs, and a window that looked out over the Miracle Mile district, toward the green strip of Hancock Park in the middle distance. I had been in that room twice before for other matters. It was a good room for serious conversations. Neutral, professional, nothing on the walls that told you anything about the people who used it. I arrived at 1:15 and sat with Dale for 45 minutes, going through the documents one final time. The contract itself was 11 pages. The personal guarantee clause was on page 7, embedded in a section titled Financial Responsibility and Indemnification. Written in the clear, precise language Dale used for everything, which meant it was completely legible to anyone who read it carefully and easy to move past for anyone who did not. "He will skim," Dale said. "They always skim when they think they already know what the document says. He thinks he knows what this document says because I told him what it says. I said. I told him it was a straightforward co-investment structure with favorable tax positioning. I told him the personal commitment language was standard for off-market deals of this type. I used the word standard twice. Dale looked at me over the rim of his reading glasses. You have done this before. I have been on the other side of it before, I said. There is a difference. This is the first time I have built the trap. At 1:58, Jason Mercer walked into Dale's office wearing a charcoal suit that fit him the way expensive suits fit men who buy them specifically to be taken seriously in rooms like this one. He carried a leather portfolio under his arm, and he shook Dale's hand with the appropriate amount of deference, the handshake of a man who understands he is in someone else's professional territory and is demonstrating his comfort with that. He shook my hand next and said, "Richard, good to see you." His eyes were alert and interested and entirely confident. We sat. Dale offered water. Jason accepted. The documents were arranged in a neat stack in the center of the table, face down, which I had asked Dale to do because there is a particular kind of anticipation that a face-down document creates in a man who believes he is about to receive something valuable. I presented the opportunity the way I had rehearsed it, with the unhurried confidence of a man sharing something he does not strictly need to share. A commercial parcel in the Crenshaw corridor recently rezoned for mixed-use development seller, motivated by an estate situation requiring fast resolution. Projected returns over a 5-year hold were strong. The structure required a direct personal commitment from both parties to satisfy the seller's attorney, who had insisted on individual rather than corporate signatories due to previous complications with a shell company in an earlier transaction. That last detail was the one that mattered. Jason needed to hear a reason why personal signatures were required that had nothing to do with him. He nodded as I spoke. His pen was already out of his portfolio. "What is the total commitment figure?" he asked. "On your side, the personal guarantee covers up to $4.2 million, I said. "That is the ceiling. In practice with the returns we are projecting, your exposure window is 18 months maximum." Jason wrote a number on the legal pad in front of him, circled it. "And the upside. Conservative estimate puts your return at 1.8 times your commitment over 5 years, I said. "Dale has the full projection model if you want to walk through it." "I trust your numbers, Richard." He said it with the easy warmth of a man who had decided the performance portion of the meeting was complete and the business portion could proceed. "Let me look at the agreement." Dale slid the document across the table. Jason opened it and began reading. I watched his eyes move across the pages. He read the first 2 pages carefully, the way people read the beginning of documents. His pace increased on pages 3 and 4. By page 5, he was moving at the speed of a man confirming, rather than discovering, his pen tracing lightly under certain phrases as he went. He paused on page 6 and asked a question about the timeline for the initial capital transfer, which Dale answered precisely and completely. He turned to page 7. His eyes moved across the financial responsibility section. His pen slowed for a moment, then continued. He turned to page 8. I breathed normally. I kept my hands flat on the table. I looked at the window and the Hancock Park greenery in the middle distance, and I thought about the house I had designed for Emily and the window I had widened because she wanted a reading chair, and the 40-year-old muscle memory in my hands that knew the difference between a structure that would hold and one that only appeared to. Jason reached the signature pages. There were 4 places requiring his name. He uncapped his pen and signed the first with the clean, decisive stroke of a man who has decided. He signed the second. He signed the third. On the 4th page, just below the final signature line in the smaller font, that documents reserve for the language they consider self-explanatory, was a single sentence that Dale had placed there with the quiet precision of a man who had spent 2 years in a courtroom, wishing he had placed it somewhere 2 years earlier. By executing this agreement in an individual capacity, the signatory acknowledges sole and unlimited personal liability for all obligations herein superseding any prior business authorization or corporate indemnification. Jason signed the 4th page and capped his pen and set it on the table and looked up at me with the expression of a man who has just done something he considers a formality and is ready to move on to the part where it benefits him. "Done," he said. "Almost I say sa and I said. I said it pleasantly. I said it the way I say most things, without particular emphasis, without a change in register. The word sat on the table between us for exactly 2 seconds. Then the conference room door opened. Detective Brenda Okafor walked in first, her badge on her belt and her legal pad in her hand, and the unhurried authority that I had recognized the first morning I met her, and had not stopped being grateful for since. Behind her came 2 officers in plain clothes and 1 in uniform carrying a document case. Jason looked at the door. Then he looked at me. His face did something I had not seen it do before in 4 years and 2 months of watching it. It lost its arrangement. The careful surface that had been in place every moment I had known him came apart, the way a facade comes apart, when the underlying structure fails, not all at once, but in sequence, each piece following the one before it, with a speed and completeness that told you the whole thing had been held together by pressure alone. "Richard," he said. I looked back at him across the table and did not say anything at all. Brenda moved through the room with the economy of motion that comes from doing difficult things so many times they no longer require extra steps. She set her legal pad on the table, introduced herself and her colleagues to Jason by title and name, and placed a document in front of him that she identified as a search and seizure warrant covering his financial records, electronic devices, and any instruments related to the properties and accounts named in the attached schedule. Jason looked at the warrant. Then he looked at me. "You need to call your attorney," I said. It was not advice delivered with warmth. It was the first completely honest sentence I had said to him in 3 weeks, and I wanted it to land that way. His jaw tightened. The facade was gone, but what replaced it was not panic. It was the cold recalculation of a man who has built his life on his ability to reframe situations faster than the people around him can process them. He straightened in his chair and looked at Brenda and said, "I would like to understand what I am being accused of before I say anything further." "That is your right," Brenda said. She pulled out her chair and sat across from him with the patience of someone who has nowhere else to be. "Mr. Mercer, I am going to outline what we have, because in my experience that saves time for everyone." She opened her legal pad. "We have a recording made in your vehicle on November 14th of last year, in which you describe in your own voice a deliberate plan to exploit your wife's diminished capacity for financial gain. We have laboratory confirmation that the medication found in your wife's possession was not the medication prescribed to her. We have a property document bearing your wife's signature obtained during the period in which she was under the influence of that substituted medication. We have a planning document outlining a timeline for the disposal of assets belonging to your wife and her father. And we have a signed agreement executed 20 minutes ago in which you personally guaranteed sole liability for obligations you had previously attempted to transfer to your father-in-law's name." She set her pen down. "That is what we have today," she said. "There is more, but that is what we have today." Jason was quiet for a moment. His hands were on the table and he was looking at them with the focused attention of a man doing very fast arithmetic. Then he looked at me and said, "Richard, whatever they have told you, Whatever story they have constructed, I need you to understand that I have documentation that places liability for the earlier business obligations squarely on your authorization. You are not clear of this. He is actually. Dale spoke from the corner of the room where he had been standing since Brenda arrived, quiet, and still in the way Dale was quiet, and still when he was most certain of something. He walked to the table and set down 2 pages. The corrective instrument filed this morning with the county recorder's office limits the scope of Richard's original authorization to its explicitly stated purpose and retroactively excludes all obligations entered into outside that scope. It was reviewed by 3 attorneys and filed at 9:47 this morning. Dale looked at Jason over his reading glasses with the expression of a man who has been waiting 8 years to be in this room. You are the sole obligated party on every instrument you signed using that authorization. Jason's hands pressed flat against the table. You set me up, he said. His voice had lost its careful calibration. The pleasantness was entirely gone, and what was underneath was colder and less interesting than I had expected. I had thought, without quite realizing I was thinking it, that there might be something more under the surface. Some complexity or depth that explained how a person becomes what Jason had become. There was not. There was just a man who was very good at taking things and had finally run into a structure he had not built and could not control. You set yourself up, I said. I paid attention. Brenda stood and nodded to the officer in uniform who had been standing near the door. He moved to Jason's side of the table, and Jason stood automatically, the trained compliance of a man who understands when a situation has moved past the point of negotiation. Brenda read him his Miranda rights in the clear, unhurried way she did everything, and Jason listened with his eyes on the table and his hands being guided behind his back. I stood up from my chair. The Rolex was on my left wrist where it had been since the evening Jason put it there. I reached across with my right hand and unclasped it. The metal was warm from my skin and heavier than I had remembered when I first put it on the weight of something that had been pretending to be a gift. I set it on the table next to the signed contract documents. I did not say anything about it. I did not look at Jason when I did it. I simply placed it on the table and straightened up and looked at Brenda, who gave me a single nod that meant she had seen it and understood it and would handle it from here. Jason was at the door. He turned once and looked back at the room, at Dale, at me, at the watch on the table. Something moved through his expression that I could not name and did not try to. Then the officer moved, and Jason moved with him, and the door closed. Dale sat down in the nearest chair and let out a slow breath. It was the most undone I had ever seen him. "It is done," he said. I stood at the table and looked at the signed contract, and the watch beside it, and the window behind them. Both the Miracle Mile stretching west in the afternoon light. And I thought about Emily in her house 8 miles east, with the reading chair in the widened window and the drafting kit under the table, and 4 months of recordings on a hard drive, and the particular courage of a person who holds on not because they are certain anyone is coming, but because holding on is the only thing left to do. "Almost," I said. I picked up my jacket and walked to the door. I had somewhere to be. Every light in the house was on. I noticed it before I turned off the engine, sitting in the driveway, with my hands still on the wheel and the quiet of the car around me. The front window, the kitchen, the upstairs hallway, the small lamp in Emily's studio that she kept on a timer, and that had not been working properly since Jason changed the settings 8 months ago. All of it on. The house looked the way a house looks when someone inside it has decided, consciously or not, that they are done with the dark. I sat in the driveway for a moment longer than I needed to. I had built things for 40 years, and I had learned that there are moments after a structure is complete, when you have to stop and look at it before you go inside. Not because anything still needs doing. Because some things deserve a moment of being seen before the next thing begins. I went inside. Emily was in the kitchen. She was standing at the counter, not sitting. Standing with her weight distributed carefully between both feet, the injured one still favored, but bearing more than it had yesterday. She had made soup. The real kind, not from a can, the kind that requires chopping and timing, and the decision to begin something an hour before you need it finished. The smell of it filled the whole downstairs the way smells do in houses that have been closed up for too long and are finally being let breathe. She turned when she heard the door. She looked at my face and read it the way she had been reading my face since she was 3 years old, with the particular fluency of a child who learned early that her father expressed most things through what he did not say, rather than what he did. Her eyes filled immediately, and she pressed her lips together hard and lifted her chin. "It is done," I said. Emily set down the wooden spoon she was holding. She put both hands flat on the counter and breathed in through her nose, and out through her mouth, the slow, deliberate breath of someone absorbing something they have been waiting to absorb for a very long time. Her shoulders pulled back, the line of her spine straightened by degrees, vertebra by vertebra, like a structure finding its load path after a weight has been removed. I watched my daughter stand up straight for the first time in longer than either of us wanted to count. Then she crossed the kitchen and put her arms around me and held on, and I held on back, and neither of us said anything for a while because there was nothing that needed saying that the holding did not already cover. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "Tell me," I told her. "Not everything, not the details that belong to a process still unfolding, but the shape of it. The signed contract. Dale's corrective instrument. Brenda arriving with her colleagues. The document that made Jason personally liable for every obligation he had tried to place on my name. The moment the conference room door had closed behind him, Emily listened with her arms crossed and her chin level, and her eyes on my face. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "The house. Brenda has filed for a court order freezing all assets associated with Jason's name pending the investigation." I said, "Your attorney will need to appear at the hearing, but based on what Brenda told me this afternoon, the property should revert to your sole ownership within 60 days. Possibly faster." Emily nodded slowly. 60 days, or faster. She turned back to the stove and picked up the wooden spoon and stirred the soup with the focus of someone who needs to do something with their hands while their mind does its work. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same chair I had sat in the first morning I came back, and I felt the specific exhaustion of a person who has been holding something up for a long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. "Dad," Emily said, still facing the stove. "Can I ask you something? Anything? When did you know not about Jason? Not about the plan?" She turned around and leaned back against the counter and looked at me. "When did you know that I was going to be all right, not just safe? All right." I thought about it honestly the way she deserved. "Hatin, when you handed me the USB drive," I said. "You had been alone in that house in that situation for 4 months, and you had still found a way to be precise. You had still found a way to be ready." I looked at my daughter. A person who does that in those circumstances does not need rescuing. They need a door opened. Emily's throat moved. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way she had done since she was small when she was deciding whether to let herself cry. Then she looked back at me and said, "He told me I was too much. He said it so many times I started to say it to myself." "I know." She said I would wake up in the morning and the first thing I would think was try not to be too much today. Her voice was even, but her hands had tightened around the wooden spoon. I said it so many times it started to sound true. I stood up from the table. I walked to the counter and stood next to my daughter, and we both looked at the soup turning slowly in the pot, and I said, "Your mother used to say that the most dangerous lies are the ones that fit inside the space where the truth should be. They are not loud. They do not announce themselves. They just sit there and take up room until you forget there was ever anything else." Emily was quiet. "The truth," I said, "is that you are exactly enough. You have always been exactly enough. And then the room that lie was sitting in belongs to you." She leaned her head sideways against my shoulder for a moment. Just a moment. Then she straightened up and tasted the soup and added salt and said, "It needs another 10 minutes. "I am not going anywhere," I said. She smiled then. Not the careful smile I had seen her use on Jason, the one calibrated to take up as little space as possible. The other one. The one that was Carol's and hers and nobody else's, the one that started at the corners and took its time. That smile was the first completely normal thing I had seen in 37 days. I sat back down and waited for the soup to be ready, and listened to my daughter move around her kitchen, and I thought that 40 years of building things had not prepared me for this. The specific work of watching someone rebuild themselves, which requires no tools at all, and is the most precise thing I have ever witnessed. The attorney's office was on the 14th floor of a building on Bunker Hill, the part of downtown Los Angeles, where the streets slope steeply enough that the city had to build escalators into the hillside in 1969 to connect the upper district to the lower one. I had always found that detail clarifying. Some terrain is too steep to walk without help. The solution is not to pretend otherwise. The solution is to build the escalator and get on with it. Margaret Osei had been Emily's attorney for 3 weeks, referred by Brenda Okafor, who had told me simply that Margaret was the person she called when someone needed the right outcome and not just a good argument. Margaret was 51 Ghanaian American, with a precise way of speaking that left no room for misunderstanding and no patience for questions that were actually statements in disguise. She had reviewed every document we had gathered, interviewed Emily for 4 hours across 2 sessions, and filed 7 motions in the first 10 days alone. Emily sat beside me at the conference table. She was wearing a jacket I had not seen before, dark blue, the kind of jacket a person buys when they are deciding to take up the space they are entitled to. Her spine was straight. Her hands were folded on the table. She had brought her own notepad. Margaret set a document in the center of the table and turned it toward us. The court granted the prejudgment attachment order on all assets associated with Jason Mercer's name 6 days ago, she said. That order freezes his ability to transfer, encumber, or dispose of any property pending resolution of the criminal and civil proceedings. She pointed to a highlighted section. The property on Arcadia Boulevard is specifically named. As of this order, it cannot be touched. Emily looked at the highlighted section. Her finger traced the address without pressing down the lightest possible contact. The personal guarantee instrument executed on April 22nd, Margaret continued, has been reviewed by the court-appointed financial examiner and confirmed as valid and binding. Jason Mercer's personal liability on the associated obligations is not in dispute. She removed her glasses and set them beside her notepad. His attorneys have filed a motion arguing the contract was signed under duress. The motion cites the presence of law enforcement in the building at the time of signing. Yet they were not in the room when he signed, I said. Correct. They entered after all signatures were obtained. The motion is weak, and I expect it to be denied within 30 days. Margaret looked at me directly. However, I want you to understand that weak motions still require responses, and responses require time. The full resolution of the financial liability question may take longer than the criminal proceedings. How much longer? The criminal case could move to trial within 12 to 18 months. The civil financial matter, given the complexity of the asset structure Jason created, could take 2 to 3 years to fully unwind. She said it the way doctors say difficult things clearly and without apology, because clarity is a form of respect. Emily will have the house. The criminal process will determine the rest. Emily wrote something on her notepad. I looked at what she wrote. It was the word house with a circle around it, and nothing else. What about the debts he attempted to transfer to my name? I asked. Margaret slid a second document across. The corrective instrument Dale Whitfield filed on April 22nd has been accepted by the court as evidence that the original authorization was exceeded in scope. The examiner has identified 17 transactions that fall outside the stated purpose of the original document. She looked at me. You are not liable for any of them. 17. The same number Dale had identified 8 years ago when Jason had done the same thing to him with a different name on the authorization. I thought about Dale sitting in the corner of the conference room on Wilshire watching Brenda read Jason his rights, letting out that slow breath when the door closed. 8 years of carrying something, and then one afternoon in April when the weight finally went somewhere it belonged. Margaret went through 3 more documents in the next 40 minutes. Emily asked precise questions at precise moments, the kind of questions that told me she had read everything Margaret had sent her and had not simply waited to be told what to understand. When Margaret finished, Emily asked one final question. Is there anything Jason can do from where he is now that affects me or my father? Margaret considered it. His attorneys can file motions. That is the legal process, and it will continue. But his ability to act outside of that process, to access assets, to contact you directly, to influence the financial structure in any unsupervised way, is effectively zero. She looked at Emily with the directness that was apparently her default mode. He has no more moves that are not visible. Emily nodded once, decisively. In the elevator going down, Emily stood beside me and watched the floor numbers descend and said, Margaret is terrifying. She is excellent, I said. Same thing. Emily looked at the elevator doors. Dad, the corrective instrument Dale filed, the 17 transactions. He did the same thing to Dale, did he not? The same structure? Yes. So Dale knew exactly what to write to close it? Yes. Emily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Jason chose the wrong family to do this to. I looked at my daughter standing straight in the elevator in her dark blue jacket with her notepad under her arm and the particular steadiness of someone who has come through something and has not pretended it was easy and has not let it make her smaller. He chose the wrong daughter, I said. Outside on Bunker Hill, the afternoon sun was doing what it does in Los Angeles in May, which is to fill every vertical surface with a light so direct and specific that the city looks temporarily like a photograph of itself. We walked to the car, and Emily stopped at the passenger door and looked out over the downtown skyline, the mix of old and new that Los Angeles had never bothered to resolve, because the city had always understood that some contradictions are structural and not worth fixing. What do you want to do today? I asked. After this? Emily thought about it. Go home, she said. Open the windows. Cook something that takes a long time. I unlocked the car. That, I said, sounds exactly right. I looked down at my left wrist out of habit. The absence of the Rolex was still noticeable the way the absence of a load-bearing element is noticeable in a structure that has redistributed itself correctly. Not a problem. Just a different weight distribution. Just the building finding its new center. I got in the car and drove my daughter home. 2 months after the afternoon on Bunker Hill, I drove to Emily's house on a Saturday morning in July with a box of pastries from the bakery on Vermont Avenue that she had liked since graduate school and that I had been buying for her on weekend visits since before she had a house to visit her in. The studio window was open. I saw it from the street. Before I pulled into the driveway, the window of the room Emily used for her design work, the one above the front door on the second floor that caught the morning light best. The curtains were moving in the early breeze and the lamp on her drafting table was on, and there was music coming from somewhere inside, something with a guitar that I did not recognize but that sounded like a person who had decided to take up a reasonable amount of sonic space in the world. I sat in the car for a moment and let that be enough. When I knocked, she called, "Come in," from upstairs, and I went through the unlocked front door and up the stairs and found her at her drafting table with 3 drawings spread across the surface and a coffee mug on the corner that had been there long enough to leave a ring. She was wearing paint-stained jeans and a flannel shirt with the sleeves pushed up and her hair pulled back with a pencil. The exact image of a person who has not thought once this morning about how she appears to anyone. "New project?" I asked. She looked up, and her face had the particular animation it got when she was in the middle of something she cared about. The animation I had not seen in longer than I wanted to calculate. Residential renovation in Silver Lake. A couple 1930s craftsmen. They want to open the back of the house to the yard without losing the original character. She turned one of the drawings toward me. The structural challenge is interesting. The rear wall is load-bearing, but the beam situation is not what the original permits show. I looked at the drawing. She had marked the load path in red pencil with the notation system I had taught her when she was 16, and had started spending Saturday afternoons in my office looking at blueprints, because she had said it was either that or go to the mall with her friends, and the mall gave her a headache. "Your beam solution is right," I said, "but you will want a second point of support here." I tapped the drawing. "Otherwise, you are transferring too much lateral load to this corner." Emily leaned over and looked where I was pointing and made a small sound of recognition. "I was going to put a post there, but I thought it would interrupt the sightline." "It will interrupt the sightline less than the ceiling coming down," she laughed. The real laugh, the one that started low and did not ask permission. She picked up a pencil and made a note on the drawing and said, "Okay, post." Dale arrived at 10 with his satchel and the slightly improved gait that told me his knee had been looked at finally, which I chose not to comment on, because Dale was not a man who received commentary on his physical choices without a specific expression that was not worth inviting. He shook Emily's hand at the studio door and said, "You look well, huh?" And Emily said, "I feel well," and the simplicity of that exchange, the complete and mutual understanding of what it had cost to get from one condition to the other, was the most efficient conversation I had witnessed in months. We went downstairs at 11. Emily made sandwiches with the ease of a person who has reclaimed her own kitchen, moving between the counter and the refrigerator, with the unself-conscious efficiency of someone who is not performing domesticity, but simply doing it. Dale sat at the table and told her about the progress of the financial examiner's review, the specifics of which were dry but which Emily tracked precisely, asking questions that told him she had been reading the documents Margaret sent and was not waiting to be summarized. At 12:30, Emily said she wanted to go to the Green Valley store. Dale looked at me. I looked at Emily. "Linda has been texting," Emily said. "I have been meaning to go. I keep finding reasons not to, and then I look out the front window and I can see the store from here, and I think today. And then it is not today." She folded the wax paper from her sandwich neatly. "I want it to be today." We walked. The three of us, which had not been planned, but which felt correct, down Arcadia Boulevard in the July heat, the sidewalk throwing back the warmth of a city that does not apologize for its summers. The Green Valley store had a new sign since I had last looked at it closely, the old one having been replaced sometime in the spring, with one that was slightly larger and considerably brighter. Linda Marsh was behind the customer service counter. When we came through the door, the same counter she had been standing at, the night she found my number in Emily's phone, and made a decision that most people in her position would not have made. She looked up when the door opened and saw Emily first, and her face did something immediate and unguarded, the expression of a woman who has been carrying a quiet worry for months and has just been relieved of it. She came around the counter faster than I would have expected from a woman her age, which was something I kept to myself. She took Emily's hands and looked at her and said, "Look at you." Emily smiled. "It has been a few months." 4, Linda said. I counted. She looked Emily over with the frank assessment of someone who has earned the right to look. "You look like yourself." "I am working on it," Emily said. Linda squeezed her hands and let go and looked at me over Emily's shoulder. I nodded once. She nodded back. Some things do not require more than that between two people who were strangers 4 months ago and are something else now, something without a precise name but with a clear weight. We stayed 20 minutes. Linda showed Emily the renovation she had done to the back storage room, which had apparently been a project of some duration and considerable personal investment. Emily asked questions about the shelving configuration, with the professional interest of someone who cannot help seeing the structural logic in a space, and Linda answered with the pride of someone who had done most of the work herself. On the way back down Arcadia Boulevard, Emily walked between Dale and me in the July heat and said without particular preamble, "I called Sarah yesterday. We are having dinner next week." "Good," I said. "And I emailed 2 of my old colleagues from the firm I worked at before." She squinted against the light. "I am not ready to go back to that scale of project yet, but I wanted them to know I am here." "Also good." She looked sideways at me. "You are not going to say anything else? What else is there to say?" She considered that. "Nothing, I suppose." "Correct." Dale made a sound beside us that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same neighborhood. We turned onto the block where Emily's house sat, and I could see the studio window still open at the top, the curtain still moving in whatever remained of the morning breeze. The light on the drafting table was still on. The drawings were still spread across the surface, the load path marked in red, the new post penciled in where the ceiling needed it. Emily stopped at her front gate and looked up at the window, and then looked at me. "Dad," she said. "Yeah. Thank you for coming home." I looked at the open window and the moving curtain and the light inside that had been on all morning without anyone checking whether it should be. "I will always come home," I said. "Every time." She opened the gate and went inside, and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the July heat and looked at the house I had designed in a Saturday afternoon at a dining room table while Carol graded papers across from me, and I thought that I had built it to last, and it had lasted, and that was the thing about structures made with the right materials and the right intention. They hold. The house had been repainted in October. Emily had chosen the color herself, a warm off-white she described as the color of good paper. And the interior looked the way rooms look when someone has made a deliberate decision about what they want to wake up inside of every morning. I brought the plaque on a Saturday in November. It had been in my office for 3 years, mounted on the wall beside the window where the light hit it in the afternoon. The California Council Citation for Residential Design Excellence, awarded to Emily Calloway for the Pasadena Adaptive Reuse Project in 2022. I had told clients about it for 3 years. I had pointed to it without being asked. I had never once considered that the person whose name was on it might need it back. Emily opened the box and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. Then she carried it to the living room and held it against the wall above the reading chair, the one in the window I had widened, and looked at me. "Here," she asked. "Your wall?" I said. "Your call." She hung it there. We stood and looked at it together in the November afternoon light, and I thought about Carol and about the Saturday she had sat across from me at the dining room table while I drew this house, and about everything a person builds in a lifetime, and what actually holds when the pressure comes. Emily put her hand briefly on my arm. "She would have liked today," she said. "She would have taken credit for it," I said. Emily smiled. She would have been right. I drove home in the early dark, with the windows down and the city moving past and nothing on the radio. And I thought that 40 years of building things had taught me one thing I had not known how to say until now. The strongest structures are not the ones that resist every force. They are the ones designed to transfer the load to where it can be carried, to find the person beside you who can bear the weight, to trust them with it. Emily had trusted me with hers. I had tried to be worth that. I believe I was. I have told you a family story tonight. Not a perfect one, not a clean one, but an honest one. I spent 40 years building structures designed to last, and I almost missed the most important thing right in front of me because I trusted when I should have been watching and I stayed away when I should have come home. Do not make my mistake. Do not wait for a stranger to call you at midnight before you ask your daughter if she is truly all right. Do not confuse a man's handshake with his character. And do not ever let anyone convince the person you love that needing help makes them too much. I am not a perfect father. These grandpa stories do not come from a man who had all the answers. They come from a man who finally asked the right questions late but not too late. I believe God puts the right people in the right windows at the right moment. Linda Marsh was standing in hers. I am grateful she looked. This is what family story means to me. Not the absence of pain, the presence of someone who comes back. If this family story stayed with you, leave a word in the comments. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if these grandpa stories have found you here, please subscribe so the next one finds you too. Thank you for staying until the end. The stories ahead contain some fictional elements created for the purpose of reflection and understanding. If that is not for you, there is no shame in choosing something else. But if you are still here, I am glad. I will see you in the next one.